Lesson planning and lesson preparation. Are they the same thing? Digital transformation and the way people use technology has really moved on recently, especially over the last few years. Resources now are much more easily shared. They're digital. People can find resources off the internet, and lots of departments have everyone in the department using very similar resources. Planning has changed. Planning is not what it used to be. So a dictionary defined the word planning as the process of planning activities or events in an organised way so that they are successful. So I suppose lesson planning has to have that idea to the end. It's so that the lesson is successful. Preparation is an action taken to become ready. So the meanings are very, very similar, but there is a very slight difference between those things. I'm not as bothered about the formal definition of planning and preparation. I think it's more important to have an agreed language on what these things are not. Planning is not finding a PowerPoint or a resource. That is not a lesson plan. A lot of student teachers I've had over the years, when I've asked to see their planning for a lesson, they show me a PowerPoint, and I'm very, very quick in correcting them with the language that that PowerPoint is not their lesson plan. It doesn't contain the things that they need to make the lesson successful. It's part of their preparation, perhaps, but it is not their lesson plan. A lesson plan is also not a proforma that is filled in. Many people who've been teaching for many years will remember having to fill in long and often onerous lesson plans for observed lessons. But that's not a lesson plan, because planning a lesson is far more of an organic thing. There's far more little elements to it. You could never write it all down on a piece of paper. I've heard the phrase that there's no such thing as a good or bad resource. It's how the resource is used. But I don't agree with that in every context. I have seen what I think are sometimes bad resources before, but I think the key principle there is it is how it is used. You can have an absolutely wonderful resource or a wonderful PowerPoint that has been really successful in one lesson, and in another lesson it is not. So I think, especially as leaders, having the language correct and not sending a PowerPoint and saying this is a lesson plan, and being very clear that this is a resource that might be useful if it's prepared. In my own experience, when delivering elements of pastoral time, we often have a PowerPoint that's sent to support us, and I know that the time I spend with the class, the form group, is usually much more productive if I've taken what's been sent to me and made it my own and read it through and had a think and adapted it. And it's not to say that that resource wasn't absolutely perfect for somebody else, or perhaps for another class, but for me it needed adaptation to be good. And I think we've all seen presentations being delivered where somebody is just clicking through slides that they don't really know what's on them and kind of making up what they say as they go along. And that's not a good lesson. That's never a good lesson. In another CPD video, I discuss responsive teaching. In some ways, the angle that I approach lesson planning here seems miles away from responsive teaching. It is not intended to be. In many ways, this presentation is about planning lessons based on our expectations, where we think the class are, how we intend them to respond, how we intend them to behave, what we intend them to learn. We need this starting point. The reality is, we may need to deviate slightly. We may need to deviate massively. We may need to change the plan for some. We may need to change the plan for all. That PowerPoint, resource, or intended example may need to be replaced with something else. This CPD is intended to go alongside responsive teaching, not to replace it. In that other, equally important CPD, I discuss how we plan and prepare to teach responsively. Some other thoughts on lesson planning. So one lesson will take longer to plan than another lesson. As an experienced teacher, there's some topics I've taught so many times, I can walk into a room with a board pen, and although I may not know the class, the actual delivery of that topic is something probably with very little preparation I can do. There are other topics. I'm teaching a new further maths syllabus at the moment, where a lesson sometimes takes me hours to plan. Some lessons do take longer to plan than others. Teaching experience changes how lessons are planned. An experienced teacher with just a few words can go in and deliver an outstanding lesson. Somebody who's never taught that before will need to spend longer to make sure that it can be delivered well. Collective planning does save time. Talking as a department about how you're going to teach something, or having someone plan something for their class and share that. And that's not just sharing the resources, but sharing the delivery. That means that the next person can adapt that in far less time and teach an effective lesson. And also, teacher workload is something that needs to be considered when we establish routines for planning. It may be that somebody teaching in their first year doesn't teach A-level, because A-level lessons often take longer to plan than Key Stage 3 lessons. It may be that a teacher teaches a few different classes in one year group, so the planning for one lesson can be adapted to the next lesson. Shared planning makes individual planning easier, and curriculum planning can make excellent lessons easier to plan for less experienced teachers. Curriculum planning is a big part of the big picture of what lesson planning is. So the first part of planning a good lesson is having the right objectives. And the right objectives start with a reflection on what happened last lesson. Did the class learn what you wanted them to? Or do you need to spend more time on that? It's not okay just to move from one lesson to the next with a new set of objectives without any real thought process on whether or not we've been successful in what we were trying to achieve before. The scheme of learning can be very useful in helping us plan those objectives, but we can never just take from the scheme of learning, this is lesson 1, this is lesson 2, this is lesson 3, those are our objectives. But the objectives do come from our scheme of learning, and a well-written scheme of learning will have that natural progression. And for inexperienced teachers in particular, that's essential, because it's difficult to discern what the key objectives are. When considering objectives, we need to know where the student has come from, what are we building on? And that may be for students in Year 7 reflecting on the primary curriculum. In my schemes of learning, I have links in Year 7 to the Key Stage 2 national curriculum, and I often just hyperlink it with a page reference so that people know what the student should be secure on. Obviously we need to check that that's secure as we go through, but what is the previous year? If you're teaching year 9, where does that build from the year 8 curriculum? Curriculum should be cyclic, so they should be looking to build from somewhere, and they're also looking to go somewhere. Where do we want that student to be at the end of Key Stage 4, at the end of Key Stage 5? What do we need to teach them in that year? So the schemes of learning, the midterm planning is essential for that, but also the teacher having a really good idea of where that lesson stands in the big scheme. We need to plan what we're going to write, what we're going to show, what we're going to model. We need to plan our board work. We need to plan what we're going to write on the board, how we show students how to solve a problem. If it's a problem that's there, we need to model, and sometimes we need to practice. We've got something difficult that we need to prepare for. In maths there are some very difficult derivations, at A level in particular, and I still need to practice those before the lesson to make sure they're fluid. We need to be role models, and we need to show students what we expect them to do in their books. A good example of this is drawing a graph. If we want students to be able to draw a nice graph, we need to model how it's done. We can't just project PowerPoint slides up showing these are the axes, this is how we scale. We need to use a visualizer, or we need to write it on the board, or we need to have a board pen with a Wacom and make sure it's really, really clear. The idea of I do, you do, we do is integrated into the way lessons are planned. This is often the part of the lesson which is make or break in maths lessons. If the teacher's not able to model the maths really, really clearly, the students often aren't able to do it themselves. We need to plan what we're going to say and what we're going to ask. For experienced teachers, this comes quite naturally. They know what to say. Their questioning is well developed. The idea of having oracy in their lessons is really key, and it's already been planned. The planning has happened long ago, perhaps by trial and error. We do need to plan our script though. If it's something we've not taught before, if it's a very difficult concept to try and explain how to do something that students are not going to be clear on, we need to make sure it's consistent with what their teacher in the previous year was going to say and what the teacher in the year after is going to say, and our curriculum planning can really help us with that. Key questions often need to be planned and who they're directed at. We need to try and develop high order questioning, not just closed questions, but ask students why, to try and develop that dialogue and understanding. The language and key vocabulary is very important in lesson plans, but it is not something that's just restricted to a slide at the beginning of the lesson that this is the key vocabulary. I have no problem with people doing that, but is the teacher using that key vocabulary through the lesson? Are they demanding that the class uses that vocabulary in the questions and in the questioning? Misconceptions are included in this. What you're going to say, what you're going to ask, to say things like, ooh, and lots of people might make this misconception. This is a common exam error. Consistency. We need to plan the activity. And I've deliberately put this down as number 4, because this is the point where perhaps a resource can be thought of. Or you could look through a textbook to find appropriate questions, or you can write the questions yourself, or you could put the questions on a PowerPoint, or you could do what I normally do and just write them on the board, questions that I've planned based upon what I've just done. But an activity needs to be planned so that the class can gain skills and they can show that they've met the objectives and understood what they're trying to do. But this should only come after the first three things have been considered. We never pick an activity and then try and set objectives based upon them doing that activity, or get an activity and then look at the first few questions and then think, oh, well, what do I need to write and model so they can do the activity? What do I need to say to do the activity? We plan the objectives first, and then we plan what we need to do, what we need to write, what we need to say so they can do the activity at the end. Those are the four things that I think are the most important part of starting to plan a good lesson. People who just do these four things can teach outstanding lessons. There's a simplicity about it. The objectives, what you write and model, what you say, and the activity. Obviously, if you're starting from scratch, you could say there's a lot of work there. But how much of this is actually possible through the curriculum planning, or at least made easier? The curriculum planning has key objectives in. You've got a starting place. If the curriculum planning has examples of how work should be modelled, maybe snapshots from student books. I do that a lot in my own now. I'm trying to take pictures of exemplar student work so that teachers can see what students should be producing and what they should be modelling as a result. And again, misconceptions, key questioning points can be included in the curriculum planning. Obviously, resources can also be included there and hyperlinked. So we can really make a lot of the lesson planning easier if we have good curriculum planning. An outstanding lesson may take the simple form of modelling an aspect of the subject for a few minutes, then getting the students to practice this skill in a variety of different contexts, marking their own work as they go along, with the teacher helping and supporting those who are having difficulties. That can be an outstanding lesson, a simple lesson. Obviously, creative ideas and trying different types of lessons may also make outstanding lessons. Students can respond very well to variety in their learning. Often this has an impact on behaviour and engagement. It is, however, noteworthy that planning needed for such lessons is more demanding. Having sets of loop cards or answers under the chairs and students need to go around. These are wonderful lessons, they're wonderful ideas, and classes deserve to have them from time to time. But simple and effective lessons are the key for the majority of lessons, and then those kind of creative differences can kind of come with experience as we build our repertoire, and they get quicker to plan. But I'm certainly not trying to discourage creative different types of lessons, because those are wonderful to see. Plan to know the curriculum. I think the word curriculum is now quite interchangeable with schemes of learning, schemes of work, midterm planning, big pictures. But the idea that you know what your school, what your department's curriculum is, and you're delivering that in the lesson is very, very important. Ofsted certainly want to see curriculum planning, and then they want to see that curriculum embedded in lessons and embedded in work of students. So it's not acceptable to divert from curriculum planning and do things in your own way. Obviously, post holders have to contribute towards the planning of a curriculum, which should be organic, it should always be improving, it should always be getting better. But remembering that some topics are taught at a particular time in a particular way is usually there for very good reason. Knowing what they've been taught before and knowing that that teacher won't have pushed ahead so that you can start at a nice place for the whole class, or at least you can plan to start at that place. That's important. And also knowing what the next stages are. If you're just teaching Key Stage 3, you have to know the GCSE curriculum. You have to know what you're preparing them for. If you're teaching Key Stage 4, you have to know enough about the Key Stage 5 curriculum to know what you're preparing some of the students for. We mustn't plan to reteach things. One of the big problems, the idea that we teach a topic in Year 7 that was taught to them in Key Stage 2, and then we teach the same topic in Year 8 and the same topic in Year 9 and the same topic in Year 10. And part of that perhaps comes from not trusting that the previous person's done it well. Obviously we do revisit topics, and we have to revisit topics, and we have to include retrieval, but we have to be building. So if adding fractions was done in a particular way in primary school, how does your Year 7 curriculum make sure that it builds on that? If you're going to take adding fractions again in Year 8, how can you build on that? Perhaps that's the contextualization can involve more maturity. Perhaps there could be introduction of algebra to that. But a curriculum needs to be building. We mustn't be reteaching the same thing year after year after year. That's not a good curriculum. So the curriculum planning is this kind of big all-encompassing box which hopefully makes all the aspects of the lesson planning quicker and easier and more effective. That's not a separate thing. Planning to know the curriculum is part of planning lessons. It makes planning lessons easier and quicker. So to plan your evaluation and assessment. Assessment often is linked to kind of end of year exams or GCSE exams and exams that are used for reporting purposes, and that's one of the reasons I often prefer the word evaluation, because evaluation is more of thinking about the lesson and what went well and what didn't go well, and trying to use evidence in the lesson, which is assessment, on making those conclusions. Looking at your questioning, that has to be planned. How am I going to know that the students can do it? How you move around the room, how you look at work, the work that you're going to collect in to see, are those objectives really clear? Is what I wrote and modelled visible in the students' work? Are the misconceptions that I talked about and I discussed, have they made those? And how was the activity completed? Was it completed well or not? Evaluation and assessment needs planning. Looking at work, looking at books, mini tests. How are you going to know if the student's work is right or wrong? In maths, we often mark work just from the back of the books. Students self-assess their work. Peer assessment might be perfectly appropriate in some subjects. Sometimes you want to mark it yourself. That needs planning. But the evaluation side, I think, is a much bigger thing, and I think good teachers, they come away from their lesson thinking, was that effective? Perhaps they're thinking in the car, were my lessons good? Or maybe they're able to turn off from school. But I know I'm often thinking on the way home about my day, about the lessons, and about how effective they were. I know people in my department often at lunchtime discuss how their lessons went. Sometimes they say, oh, that lesson didn't go as well as I'd have liked, and they've reflected. But that has to be part and parcel of lesson planning, reflecting, thinking about what could be better, what do I need to do next lesson. That idea, it's almost a cycle. You plan, you evaluate, the objectives for the next lesson get decided. Now, part of me really begrudges putting this towards the latter end of my presentation, because actually part of me could put this right at the top as the very first thing we do. Plan your relationships and knowing the class. Because although outstanding lessons can happen if you don't know the class very well, but they rarely really do. It's the relationships that you see in lessons that really define outstanding lessons often, the interactions between the teacher and the group. As part of this, we do need to plan where students sit, plan our send. Do students need particular interventions in the lesson? The whole lesson can be ruined for a particular student if planning for their particular send isn't taken into account. It's the first thing we do really in lesson planning when we first of all have a class. But when you know your class and you know them well, you're not thinking about that every single lesson because you're doing it naturally. That student has this intervention, that's what I do, I know them, it's about relationships. Similar for your pupil premium students, we should know them. We're given lists with them at the beginning on each year, they may be on our seating plans, but as the year progresses, we know them, we know what they need. We know that a particular student who may not be SEND, they may not be pupil premium, but they need something special as well, and we give that to them. It's their personalities, it's trying to make those connections. Teaching is all about engagement and relationships, and as part of that, knowing the class and having those relationships, our extension, our differentiation and our scaffolding all comes under. So this is a really, really big box to think about, but I would possibly say in terms of the intrinsic lesson itself and the lesson structure, that comes after you've planned the whole, but maybe you need to go back and revisit the objectives for some students. Maybe we need to go back into that cycle. This isn't a kind of fifth most important thing. In many ways, this is the starting point, but it's all so interconnected. But we have. So I've made this model because I think it kind of creates how everything's intertwined a little bit, and things like the differentiation, the scaffolding, the most able students, how certain SEND students might have, those can also be included in the curriculum planning. Lots of curriculum plans do have differentiation and support areas there, and that's really where this should come. Some topics do need very specific differentiation, and if you need specific types of worksheet for students in those areas, they can be hyperlinked very easily through that. But the relationships is key, and that evaluation and assessment and the relationships just work together in a cycle about trying to optimize the lessons that we plan for the group of students we have, because a lesson plan for one class, even if they're the same year group, of the same ability, that might not work as well for the next class. We have to consider that. Sometimes our mood, how we approach the kind of, I suppose the level of authority that we come into the rooms with might differ. Planning the start of a lesson is very important. It sets the tone for how the lesson needs to carry on. Greeting the class by the door, saying hello to each person individually as they come in, is a wonderful way of developing those relationships, developing the right mood. Having something on the board so that students can engage immediately sets a tone often. It sets a tone for how the lesson should continue. Something maybe that challenges them and makes them think, makes them discuss, makes them think, a hook of some sort, so that kind of gets them engaged. That might be very appropriate. Or having some retrieval exercises that students can just engage with immediately and get into that idea, that learning mindset. Having things consistent across the department and across the school is a big part here. But the start of a lesson needs planning. The end of a lesson needs to be anticipated. And again, more experienced teachers do it much more naturally, but I think everyone, if they're honest, gets caught out at some point. About 10 minutes before the end of a lesson, you should be thinking, where's this going to go? If I want to do some assessment at the end of the lesson, I need to make sure that I'm preparing to do that. If I've got a series of resources planned that I perhaps wanted to use as part of the lesson, and I'm not going to get through them, now's the time to kind of think, well, no, we're going to stop here, we're going to stop at that question, and we're going to talk about it and bring it all together. It links with those objectives that we set at the beginning. And again, we might state those objectives to the class at the very beginning. We might not, it depends on your departmental policy. But having the start and the end of the lesson firmly rooted in those objectives is very important. Homework, again, it shouldn't really just be an afterthought. Sometimes that needs planning. Sometimes that's a very simple thing. In some schools, homework is set on certain days and collected on certain days. So that needs consideration if we're going to have a smooth start and a smooth finish. Maybe books need to be handed back and students need to have time to read what comments were made in their work. Maybe you need enough time for students to get planners out to record their homework. But the start and the finish of the lesson and homework does need planning. It needs to be appropriate. Again, I think the start and finish, I've already said, can tie into having the right atmosphere in the room, and the relationships are certainly the most pivotal thing in having the right atmosphere in the room. But behaviour management, rewards and sanctions, they're something that you need to know about. Maybe if you're going to a new school, that's one of the first things you need to be really clear of what the system is. And planning to reward and planning for behaviour, for positive behaviour management is something that we should all be aspiring, rather than kind of planning to write names on boards or demerit, trying to kind of create positive incentives for students to behave in the way we want them to. If a lesson is good, quite often the behaviour of students is better. We mustn't confuse enjoyment and engagement, however. We want students to engage in lessons. If they engage, they're hopefully enjoying. But our aim is to make students engage with the lesson. Okay, we can't come away and say a lesson was good if the students didn't learn anything, but they said they had a great time. It's the engagement in the lesson, engagement with the objectives, engagement with the activity we've given, looking to see have they made progress, have they listened. That's the important thing. But we do need to plan behaviour management, rewards and sanctions. Again, linked with that, the room and resources is one of the last things we need to do in our planning. And quite often that bit of planning is done right at the beginning. We set a seating plan. We check that the class are in the seating plan. Perhaps we tweak it over time, we change it. Perhaps we change seating plans regularly. Perhaps there are other elements of the room that we need to plan. Perhaps the way that books are given out or resources are given out so that it creates minimum disruption. If you know that many people in the class are not going to have a calculator and need one, you need to plan to have those calculators there or it will disrupt the lesson. If you know some students will need a new book and new books are downstairs, it will disrupt the lesson if you don't plan for that in advance. Planning the room, planning the resources, making the environment right for learning, perhaps that's reducing clutter around, kind of creating a tidy atmosphere. Whatever it takes, but plan the learning environment. That does need planning, and again, that's not on a lesson by lesson basis. Just like relationships and knowing the class and behaviour management, these are just part and parcel of what becomes ingrained in our system. So this is my complete model for planning an effective lesson. I would add for maths anyway, and I certainly do this with student teachers and less experienced teachers, I think it's appropriate and very good to teach some lessons with just a board pen and a set of written notes. It's the simplest style of lesson, and it's often the most effective, and it's flexible as well. There's no rigidity of PowerPoints. It's a skill that every maths teacher should master. Obviously there are some topics, perhaps ones with graphs that need to be interpreted where projecting up the resource is very, very powerful, but for a lot of topics, just a board pen and a set of notes or a set of questions perhaps to support that is a good lesson plan, and that's a skill that I would perhaps argue would be very valuable for lots of teachers. I don't think experienced teachers plan the amount of time they talk very much, but again, for less experienced teachers, I think you have to plan and sometimes even time yourself that you're not talking too much and you're talking the right amount. Obviously, classes turn off if you speak too much, and if you don't say enough, you haven't modelled enough, you haven't explained what the class need to do. Experienced teachers read the class, and they look and they can tell, and they use the changes in tone and changes in voice to perhaps command that a little bit more. But for the less experienced, planning what you say in a time frame and making sure you're not talking too much is very important. Outstanding lessons do not rigidly follow the initial plan as well. You might plan a lesson and deviate from it. And so much of what's in this diagram here for curriculum planning is fluid. The relationships, the behaviour, how you evaluate whether a class understands. And again, you sometimes might change your objectives as you start the lesson and see that students perhaps need something different. You set your own objectives. You model something that actually you think students need to know as a precursor. There has to be fluidity. Writing learning objectives on the board, setting up a 3-part lesson, starter, main, plenary, assessing learning objectives, peer assessment, differentiated worksheets, exit cards, avert retrieval starters, avert hinge point questions. They may all be included in a lesson, but these in themselves do not make a lesson effective. A pedagogically perfect lesson is not necessarily outstanding if it's not effective. An outstanding lesson, however, may not be pedagogically perfect if it's effective. A good structure is likely to make a lesson effective, however, and having departmental and school kind of almost templates for how a lesson looks is good for students to have that consistency and know what they're getting. So by no part of my kind of lesson planning encouragement am I encouraging anyone to deviate from what the school and departmental culture is. You know, if it is the culture to have a set of written objectives on the board when the class comes in so they can all read them, and if that's the culture that's in the school, that's what the students expect, that's what's consistent, then that is of course what must happen, because that's part of the curriculum planning. But you do not need all these things for a lesson to be outstanding in general terms. There are models online for a 5-minute lesson plan, and this is one that a number of colleagues of mine have really promoted and said that they like, and aspects of it I think are really, really nice, and they follow very nicely the things that I've talked about. There are probably things that I would like to include more in this, for maths anyway. I'd like much more room for the modelling section, because I think that's absolutely crucial. But I think perhaps for teachers who need more of a kind of a written structure for how to quickly plan a lesson and think of these things, a template like this may be effective. So as I come back towards the beginning and where I started, I think one of the most important messages that I want to put from today is that a PowerPoint or a resource is not a lesson plan. A PowerPoint or a resource is not a lesson plan. A lesson plan is not a performer. It's a much larger thing than that. Lesson planning includes knowing your class and forming good relationships. Lesson planning means knowing the curriculum really well and understanding the schemes of work and helping develop those schemes of work to make planning better, to make lessons better. One lesson will take longer to plan than another lesson, and for experienced teachers, some lessons are really quick to plan. Teaching experience changes how lessons are planned and how lessons are evaluated, and we do need to consider teacher workload when it comes to developing routines for planning. That might be thinking about the types of classes teachers teach, or teachers repeating the same classes. But teacher workload is an absolutely crucial thing, because planning 6 lessons a day maybe, all outstanding lessons which involve lots of reading, lots of creating, is just not achievable. We have to make it easy for staff to plan good lessons, and our curriculum planning is the central place to start. Coming back to the very beginning, Planning is the process of planning activities or events in an organised way so that they are successful. So what lesson planning is, it has the success involved. Preparation is just an action taken to become ready. In many ways the same, but in many ways very, very different. I hope you found the presentation useful. Thank you very much for spending the time. Any feedback would be very gratefully received.